So this is a quick introduction to color theory and the properties of color as a physical form and a pigment. So we'll start with the physical. Color is light. Without light, you have no color. Light can be streamed through a prism or a medium. Water can work as well, or a glass prism. And these 7 colors of the rainbow can be parsed. They can be separated out through the medium of glass or water, which is why you get rainbows. Whenever we separate the wavelengths out into shorter and longer wavelengths, these are interpreted as the colors. Red being the longest wave and the shortest frequency, and then violet being the opposite, being the shortest wavelength and the longest frequency. And these wavelengths and frequencies help us to see the differences and the boundaries of these colors. When the colors are all together, they just create white. So whenever we have the blue wavelength and the green wavelength and the red wavelength cross, in the center you'll get perfectly white light. And then here on the edges you'll get these variations of color. So we'll get sort of a violet or a pink when the blue and the red cross. We'll get a yellow when the green and the red cross. And then we'll get this sort of cyan in between the green and the blue. So this primary color scheme in light is called an additive process because the colors add up to white. They do not cancel each other out. They add up to the color of white. And RGB, therefore, is your primary color set for web design, TVs, theater, anything having to do with the function of actual light. Okay? Interestingly, this is a fascinating video about how wavelengths can and cannot penetrate certain mediums. So here's a really fascinating video about what happens to light as it goes deeper and deeper into a medium like water. So watch the colors as the scuba diver descends. You'll start to see a loss of certain colors. And it's because the wavelengths cannot penetrate as easily, and some can penetrate a bit easier. So right about here, only about 30 feet, we've almost lost red. The purple, you'll notice, has almost completely turned blue. The brown is gone. It almost looks like a gray. And interestingly, these two colors that appear to be holding their color are because they're fluorescent. So it's a different kind of wavelength, and these two are reacting to the scuba diver's watch. So that was sort of a fascinating tidbit. But as we're descending, we're losing the range of color that you can see in a less viscous medium. So in air, we're seeing a greater degree of the refraction of light, and the deeper we're going, the less light is getting through this medium, the less color you see. So I thought this was a really great video on what happens to color as you get further and further down into water. Yep. Let's go back. So what's happening? How do we see color? Well, the color is a combination of these wavelengths that comes from light, but it also has to do with our brain's ability to interpret the wavelengths. So it is a dual function. You need both light and you need an eye and a brain to gather or perceive the light and then interpret the light. So there's a lot going on there. So the human eye together translates light into color, okay, with the brain, translates light into color. Now there are several ways to think about this. A great and easy way to think about why you see one color and not another is that light refracts and bounces off objects. And because of the wavelengths, you see different colors. So if a light source is hitting an apple, that apple is actually absorbing all those other colors except red. Red is bouncing off into your eye. Black objects, on the other hand, really absorb all those colors, and therefore we perceive it as dark or black. And then white objects are reflecting most of them and diffusing amongst themselves, which makes white. So depending on the color object you're seeing and the amount of light, you will see certain wavelengths bouncing back. Now, how does your eye interpret these? We have two types of information in your eye, in your actual eye. We have rods and cones. So the rods are here, and these are actually mostly found at the peripheral of your vision. They're on the outskirts. And then the cones tend to be very densely found in the center of the retina. And these are for color. So your cones are color, and rods are about value. Okay, and we have more rods than we have cones, but those cones are centrally located. So an interesting test is if you put your hands out to your peripheral vision, the further out you get, that end of your vision is actually value only. There isn't color occurring on the edge of your vision. Your brain is just filling it in from what we have learned seen over time. So that's kind of an interesting little tidbit. There's also an interesting speculation that some people have a fourth cone. So they would have the red, the blue, and the green, and these tetrachromats are considered to be individuals who can see a greater spectrum of color, particularly in the yellows, because the cone is yellow. So that's kind of an interesting thing you guys can look into too. Now in color theory for artists, at least on the physical level, we have to talk about pigment. And this is a different color scheme or primary color scheme than light. So when you work in web design or on television or video, you'll be working in RGB, red, green, blue, because you're actually working with light. But when you paint or print, digitally print as well, you're working with pigment. And that primary color scheme is a different color scheme. That color scheme is the one you're more familiar with. So you would be more familiar with the red, yellow, blue as your primary color set. And then in digital printing, this is CMYK. Okay? And that's just referring to the cyan, yellow, magenta, and then the K is for black to get a nice contrast. So pigment does not operate like light. It's a very different primary color scheme, and this color scheme is called subtractive, because when all the colors in pigment come together, they cancel each other out and they subtract color, and you get a dark neutral, something very gray or brown in nature. So the color wheel that we study has to do with pigment, because that's what we're dealing with quite a lot. So in pigment, we learn to place the colors into a circle. And this is an abstract way of understanding color, but it has this useful ability to track the complements. So this is not how color occurs naturally. This is a construct that people have created to better understand color. So reds are across from greens, which are complements. Blues are across from oranges, which are complements, and yellows and violets are across from each other on the circle, which are complements. And when complements come together, they subtract their natures and they create a dark neutral, at least in pigment, in subtractive color scheme. Now, where do pigments come from? They come from a variety of places. We have minerals like ochre, yellow ochre. It's just a type of dirt, really. A lot of these very neutral brown, yellow colors come naturally from dirts, from minerals, from hard rocks that are pummeled. So we have that kind of color. And then we have colors that come from plants. So rose madder, which is very much like our alizarin crimson, comes from a root, from a plant that you can process and dry, and it creates this transparent pink. Okay? So there's a variety of places that pigment comes from. And the history of colors are fascinating and could be something interesting to dive into in your color journal. You could investigate where ultramarine comes from, a really fascinating history. That color comes from lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. So it was a rare, expensive pigment for a very long time. So it's really great to kind of look and see where your colors come from and also the toxicity of these pigments, because some pigments are quite toxic and have deathly poisonous histories. It's sort of fascinating. So you guys can definitely dive into that into your color journal. Now, to continue the basic overview, you'll want to know your 4 traits of pigment color. In pigment, we have value, the lightness and darkness of the color, saturation, which is the brilliance of that color. Hue is the family of that color. That would be the Roy G. Biv of the color. Is it a red? Is it an orange wavelength? Is it a yellow wavelength? Hue is a great way to think about wavelength. And then we have the temperature, where we very much can break the color wheel into cools and warms, cool temperatures and warm temperatures. And we'll also discuss those. But these 4 traits of color are the ways that we as artists can manipulate color and manipulate its context. Color charts can help you understand color. So this chart is based off of a couple things. It has placed the colors in their spectrum, Roy G. Biv. It is shifting the colors according to value. So in this way, we have a full value scale. And what you'll notice is the color at its fullest saturation is occupying different spaces of their bars. So yellow at its fullest spectrum is quite high. It's right here, almost at the 7, if that was a 10 scale for value. Whereas a fully saturated red is much lower in value naturally. It's a naturally dark color. And then violet is even deeper. And this has to do with the wavelengths of these colors, but it is their natural value. We'll also be talking about color in context, and that's where I'll leave this particular video. The context of the color is extremely important in understanding any color.